When people think of world building, the example people usually go to is J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. He spent his life detailing the cultures, the history, the world of Middle Earth. This is a problem because writers feel that they have to do the same thing. They have to spend their life on the cultures and history of their world. And in my opinion, I don't think that's using your time wisely. Now, I'll caveat that with I'm talking about writers that want to actually write books. If you have fun spending your time world building, creating cultures, and you're fine with messing about with that, that's perfectly cool. You go ahead. See, the reason why I'm hesitant with writers spending a lot of their time world building is because it can actually be a form of procrastination. You feel like you're doing work, you feel it's important to the story, but it actually might not be. You're wasting your time when you should really be putting your time in the actual book. The other reason why I feel it's a bit of a problem is because sometimes the things that writers focus on with world building is not actually beneficial to the story. What do I mean? Well, I'll give you an extreme example, but say that you've made a tribe of elves living in the forest. You've detailed their culture, their history, maybe what buildings they live in. Do you think that work that you've done on those elves is worth it if the elves don't appear anywhere in your story? But it doesn't even need to go to that extreme to be a problem. Say the elves are important to your story, but when you're making the culture, you decide that you want to create their religion, who they pray to. But if your story doesn't touch upon that religion and who they pray to, it's still kind of wasting your time. But even if you're world building before the story and you don't really know what the story is going to be, sometimes I think what writers focus on isn't always conducive to making stories. So going back to the elves, you know where they live, you know what buildings they live in, you know their culture, you know who they pray to, but does that mean you know what the story is of those elves? Do you know who the character is? Do you know what the situation they're dealing with is? I personally feel that just having a bunch of details and names and places on a map doesn't really help you creating stories. Maybe you're different, but I think that there's actually a better way. What is that better way? What should you actually focus on if you want to be able to make a story? What I think the most important thing is tensions. The tensions either internally or externally to the place that you're creating in the world. Basically, you want to create what is changing, evolving, or declining in your societies. How those things affect the populace within. How people are butting up against each other. How they're dealing with that. Take the elves that I was talking about earlier. Instead of detailing the place names and where they are in the map, instead I'll say in the forest that they're in, they're having a problem with the humans. Humans are coming in, chopping down trees, taking their wood, and it's creating friction. If you're world building first, that will automatically give you the kind of story you might want to tell, the kind of situation that the story is going to be focused on. And if you're making the story first, that kind of thing will add texture and tension within the story. Now, it may have seemed that I was saying that detailing the culture of the society isn't going to be a good thing, but that's not the case. Detailing the culture can be quite important for your story, especially for creating a character. While it won't determine everything about your character, what the culture finds important or finds wrong will affect the character in a certain way. Either they will agree, disagree, or somewhere in between. So because it's important to your character, it can actually be important to find out what the culture of the society is. And the best way I found to do that is to take cultures that we know in real life or in history, say the Vikings, the Romans, the British, take traits that we know about them and kind of put them in the society that you're creating. But there's two big things that I want to say about doing that. One, culture is not a monolith. For example, let's take a very stereotypical culture I see in a lot of science fiction and fantasy, the warrior culture. In a lot of books and movies I see, they can be quite stereotypical. Everyone's a warrior, everyone thinks about honour, everyone thinks that combat is the best thing. If you look at cultures, if you look at history, not everyone fought the same way. You can have the extreme, fighting is the best and we will die by the sword. Or you can have the peaceful, like, we will only fight in self-defense in the same culture. The opinions and the range in that culture can be quite different. And the second thing that you need to think about is that if you're taking from cultures that are not your own, you need to be a little bit careful about that. Some of our views or some of our stereotypes of that culture can be actually quite negative, or the only thing that we know about that culture is the negative aspects of it. But you might be surprised to hear that we can do that for historic cultures as well. For example, Attila the Hun or Genghis Khan, we think of as barbarians, and that they were just aggressive all the time and killed and raped everyone and drunk blood out of skulls, and that just isn't the case. When you look at the Roman period, when they did attack, eventually they did go into the Roman towns and live with others peacefully. If you go with the stereotypes or the negative opinions that we have of culture, you can offend that culture. But it's also just lazy. How many times have you seen a story that has barbarians like I've described? It just comes across as cliche at this point. By making it unique, by not going for the most obvious, you create a unique story out of it. But before I carry on, if you're finding this helpful, if you're liking me, click that like button. It'll be great. Now this next tip is unfortunately going to be a little bit vague because it's really dependent on the story that you're creating. The tip is to only world build the bits that are important to your story. Now this tip is just trying to go against doing work that you don't need to do. Again, if you find world building fun and you don't care that you're spending time on things that might not ever come up in the story, yes, that's perfectly fine and fun, go ahead. But if you don't want to spend time doing things that aren't going to be necessary, what you need to do is have a plan of what your story is going to be and only detail the bits that are going to be important to that story. And for this tip, the important thing to keep in mind is that the more focus your story has on a thing, the more detail you need to put on that thing. For example, let's say you've got a story that's a classic quest. It's going from place to place and you're spending a chapter on each place. Yes, you will have to create a whole world. You'll have to create each place that the character goes to. But because you're only spending a chapter on those places, you don't really need to be that detailed on those places. You don't really need to go into like every single bit of the town, the culture. You just need the broad strokes because you're not spending that much time on it. But With another story where you're focusing on one town, all the characters come from that town, the situation comes from the difficulties of that town, then yeah, you will have to put a lot of detail into the culture, the problems of that town. But because you're only focusing on that, you don't really need to think about the town that's, 5 miles north of that town, because you're not really detailing that. It doesn't come up in the story. So this is all about taking your outline, taking your plan, finding the bits of your story that having detail will add tension and texture and character to it, and detailing those things. Well, writers, I hope you found that useful. I hope you now have an understanding of what you should focus on with world building. What are those again? Well, it's what are the tensions within the society that you're creating? What is the culture of that society? And the key thing to keep in mind is only detail the things that are important to the story. So once again, if you've liked these tips, hit that like button, comment about what you found useful when you've world built, and till next time.